I want the black man gone. Replace him with 12 white engineers. I don't care what it costs. I'm not selling this company with his face on it.
Gerald Voss, plant manager, 20 years climbing one promotion from the top, said it out loud to a room full of investors, and not one of them flinched. Behind him, a photo of the factory crew glowed on the screen. His cursor slid across it and stopped on one face, the oldest man there, the only black man there. He clicked. The face vanished. A blank gray box sat where the man had been. Then Voss smiled. One black technician for 12 real engineers. That's not a loss. That's an upgrade. Nobody argued. What none of them knew, they had just erased the only mind in the building that could keep those machines breathing. The face belonged to Malcolm Ellison. 3 floors down in the belly of Halverson Precision, he was exactly where he'd been at 7 in the morning for 19 years, walking the line, one machine at a time, listening. That was the part the young techs never understood. Malcolm didn't read the diagnostics first. He listened. A bearing that would fail on Thursday made a sound on Monday, and he could hear it the way some people hear a lie in a voice. He unlocked the maintenance cage each dawn, set down his thermos, and laid out a single worn brass caliper, his father's, the jaws polished, silver thin, from 40 years of use. Then he went to work, unhurried, certain invisible. "Morning, Mr. Ellison." Danny Carter jogged up 23, an eager tablet against her chest. "Line 4's throwing a tolerance flag again." "It's not line 4, Malcolm said, not looking up. "It's the coolant temp upstream. Line 4's just honest enough to complain." Danny grinned and wrote it down. She wrote down everything he said. She was the only one who seemed to understand she was standing next to something rare, and she'd told him so once, and he'd only smiled and handed her a wrench. What none of them knew, not Danny, not Voss, not the 12 strangers about to arrive, was the second life Malcolm Ellison kept behind a locked door. In a converted garage nobody had ever been invited into sat a workbench, 3 monitors, and years of night school degrees, earned quietly, under a name shortened to initials. He funded a daughter through an engineering program he never mentioned. He published sometimes in journals nobody at Halverson read. He'd learned long ago that the world treated a quiet black man on a factory floor as furniture, and he'd decided with weary pride to let it. Being underestimated was its own strange freedom. It just cost you your name. Upstairs, that freedom was being spent without him. Voss was mid-pitch to a row of aerospace investors, the men whose contract could make his career, 0 defects. Hard deadline. More money than the plant had seen in a generation. His slide deck was a monument to the word modern, and he'd branded the whole plan without a trace of irony, Operation Clean Slate. "The old floor served us," Voss said, gesturing at the photo with its missing face. "But the future doesn't look like that. The future looks like the right people, the right image." One investor older frowned. "And the man you removed, transitioning out." Voss held the pause a half-second too long. A fit issue. He never said the word. He never had to. Everyone in that glass room heard the shape of it anyway, the way you hear thunder before you place the cloud. The older investor looked back down at his notes and wrote nothing, and that silence, too, had a price, and every man in the room had already agreed to pay it. Down on the floor, Malcolm crouched at the coolant junction, sleeves rolled, tracing a bead of condensation with one finger. He was smiling faintly, the private smile of a man solving a problem he found beautiful. The machine had a rhythm today. He could feel it the way you feel a good song about to turn. "You ever think about leaving?" Danny asked. "Somebody like you. You could go anywhere." Malcolm considered it longer than she expected. "A machine doesn't care where you went to school," he said. "It only cares if you're right." He capped the valve and stood, Line 4's flag cleared on Danny's tablet a moment later, silent as a held breath. She stared at it then, at him, and shook her head in something close to reverence. By noon, the rumor reached the floor the way heat reaches a hand near a stove. Before you touch it, you already know. 12 of them, a whole firm, to do Ellison's job. The men glanced at Malcolm and then away, ashamed of a thing they hadn't done and hadn't stopped. Malcolm heard all of it. He said nothing. He finished his shift, wiped down his bench, and squared the caliper on its felt cloth the way he did every evening. At 4:40 that afternoon, when he returned to the cage to hang his coat, he found it waiting. Taped to his locker, dead center, was a sealed white envelope. No name, just a single red stamp, pressed slightly, crooked one, blunt word, in capital letters. Transition. Beside the locker, still pinned to the corkboard, where someone had forgotten, it was a printout from Voss's deck, a project timeline cheerful and clean. Malcolm's eyes moved down the page and stopped on one line set in bright optimistic blue. Replace 1 with 12. He stood very still. He didn't open the envelope. He didn't need to. He'd spent his whole life reading machines by the sound they made before they broke, and this one was screaming. He reached up, unpinned the printout, folded it once, and slid it into his shirt pocket beside the caliper. Not as evidence, as a keepsake. A man liked to remember the exact moment the world told him what it thought he was worth. Then he did something that would have unsettled Voss if he'd seen it. Malcolm walked to the far end of the floor where a locked gray control cabinet governed the entire automation spine of the plant. He'd never once opened it in front of anyone. He didn't now. He only rested his palm flat against the steel door the way a doctor rests a hand on a patient's chest, and closed his eyes and listened. Whatever he heard in there made him smile. Not the bright smile he gave Danny, a quieter one. The smile of a man who's just realized the people about to throw him away have no idea what they've been standing on all along. Genius, he murmured to the cabinet, to the ghost of his own handwriting sealed inside it. Then Malcolm Ellison put on his coat, picked up his father's caliper, and walked out, leaving behind 12 empty chairs, 1 deleted photograph, and a machine that would not run for anyone but him. He just hadn't told them that part yet. The termination notice was dressed in the softest language money could buy. Operational realignment. Role redundancy. Effective in 14 days. Nowhere did it say the truth that a man's face had been deleted from a photograph before his job had been deleted from the floor. 2 days later, Voss gathered the plant for the unveiling. He stood beside a projected slide of 12 headshots, crisp, confident, degreed, and introduced them like a magician revealing a trick. Meet the future, he said. 12 of the finest automation engineers in the country. A full firm. They will own, run, and upgrade this entire line. He let the number land. 12. He wanted the floor to feel the arithmetic of their own worth. Their lead stepped forward, Kyle Dawson's sharp suit, sharper smile, the confidence of a man never once tested by a thing he couldn't Google. We've automated plants triple this size, Dawson said. Whatever your old guy did, 12 of us do it better. A few managers chuckled. On the floor, nobody did. Malcolm stood at the back coat already on. He didn't argue. He asked one quiet question almost gently. Your thermal calibration protocol, he said. Who renews the tolerance keys? Dawson blinked. The system handles that. Does it? Malcolm nodded slowly. A suspicion confirmed. Good luck then. That was all. No speech, no plea. He glanced once at Danny, who mouthed, "This is wrong," with her jaw tight, and he gave her the smallest shake of his head, "Not yet." Voss watched him go with the satisfaction of a man who believes he's won something. Sour grapes, he murmured to Dawson. 19 years. and he thinks the place can't breathe without him. Dawson laughed. They always think that. Malcolm passed the gray control cabinet on his way out. He didn't touch it this time. He only read the small architecture label, riveted to its door, a label the 12 had just claimed to own, and something crossed his face. That wasn't anger and wasn't grief. It was recognition. Because the design signature stamped on that plate, the one Kyle Dawson swore his team commanded, had been written years ago by a man the company had just thrown in the trash. And not one person in that building would know his handwriting when they saw it. For 3 days, the 12 engineers were magnificent. They arrived in matching polos, rolled in their own diagnostic rigs, and swept through Halverson precision like a weather system. Kyle Dawson ran the floor like a trading pit headsets, dashboards, a war room energy that made Voss glow like a proud father. The aerospace client sent an advance team to watch, and the 12 put on a show. Cycle times dropped, the line hummed. Voss walked the visitors past the gray cabinet and said the word seamless 4 times in a single hour, as if repetition could make it a fact. On day 3, the machines began to lie. It started small the way it always does, the way Malcolm could have told them it would if anyone had thought to ask. A tolerance flag on a critical bracket, then a rejected batch, then a second, then a third, each part failing by a margin so thin it shouldn't have mattered, and mattered more than anything in the building, because the aerospace contract carried a clause with no mercy in it, 0 defects. 1 bad part shipped, and the whole deal died. Dawson wasn't worried, not yet. Sensor drift, he announced with the ease of a man reading a menu. We'll recalibrate. They recalibrated. The parts kept failing. Firmware, he said. They flashed the firmware. The parts kept failing. By the end of the first bad week, the 12 engineers had done everything 12 excellent engineers do. They swapped sensors. They rewrote control loops. They ran the full diagnostic suite twice. And here was the thing that began slowly to frighten them. The system passed every test. Every subroutine reported healthy. Every calibration checked green. And then the line would produce a part that was wrong by 0.3 of a micron wrong in exactly the place the aerospace spec cared about and nowhere else. It failed on the parts that mattered. It never failed during a demo. Dawson stopped smiling around day 9. It's like the machine knows, one of his engineers said, quietly turning a scrapped bracket over in her hands, like it's doing it on purpose. Machines don't do things on purpose, Dawson snapped. But that afternoon, he went and looked at the control architecture himself alone for a long time, and what he found unsettled him in a way he did not say out loud. The code underneath the whole system was elegant, not just functional, but beautiful, layered with a self-calibrating tolerance algorithm more graceful than anything his firm had ever shipped. He'd assumed some faceless vendor had bolted it together in a hurry. Instead, he'd found the fingerprints of a single, disciplined mind, and he could not, for all his degrees, find the door that mind had locked behind it. He kept scrolling, hunting for a way in, and the deeper he went, the smaller he felt, and he hated that feeling, and he told no one about it. He told Voss they were isolating the variable. He told the client they were days from resolution. Both were lies, and he knew it, and the knowing wore on him. The worst part for Dawson wasn't the failure. It was the elegance. Every engineer he'd ever beaten had built things he could take apart, clever, sure, but knowable. This was different. Whoever wrote this code had thought 3 moves ahead of anyone who'd try to crack it, and had left buried in a comment line near the core. A single sentence that Dawson found at 2 in the morning on the worst night of the crisis. It wasn't a password. It wasn't a taunt. It read simply, "A machine should only obey the one who understands it." He stared at that line for a long time. He had a master's degree from a school with a waiting list. He had 11 brilliant people under him, and a factory technician none of them had ever met had written a sentence into the bones of this system that Dawson could feel was true and could not for all his training argue with. He closed the laptop. He didn't tell the others. He walked out to the dark parking lot and stood there, a man who had spent his whole career being the smartest person in every room, realizing he'd finally walked into a room built by someone smarter, a room he'd been hired to pretend he owned. He didn't sleep that night either. Meanwhile, 3 miles away, Malcolm Ellison was doing something radical. He was resting. He slept past dawn for the first time in 19 years. He drank his coffee at the kitchen table instead of the maintenance bench, watching the light come up gold across the yard. In the afternoons, he went out to the locked garage, the workbench, the 3 monitors, the quiet degrees, and worked on a paper he'd been meaning to finish, and he did not once check on Halverson. He didn't have to. Danny checked for him. "They scrapped a whole shift today," her texts read. "Dawson's losing it. Voss came down twice. He asked one of us if we knew where you lived." Malcolm read them and set the phone face down on the bench. He wasn't gloating. He'd built the thing they were choking on, and there's no joy in watching people drown in your own work. But he'd also spent 19 years being called furniture, and he'd decided calmly that he would not volunteer to save the men who'd deleted his face. If Halverson wanted his hands back, Halverson would have to ask for them by name, the name they'd been so eager to erase. His phone rang with a different number that week. A university calling about the paper he'd submitted months ago, the one they said a reviewer had flagged as unusually significant. Would Dr. Ellison be available to present his tolerance algorithm at a symposium in the spring, Dr. Ellison? He turned the title over in his mouth, like a coin he'd forgotten he owned. "I'll check my schedule," he said, and almost laughed, because his schedule had never in his life been emptier or more full. Back at the plant, the failures escalated on a clock nobody could stop. A missed batch became a missed shift. A missed shift became a missed shipment. A missed shipment became a phone call from the aerospace client patient professional and entirely out of patience. Sent straight up the chain fix-it in 1 week, or we walk and we take the contract to a competitor who can hold a tolerance. Voss stopped sleeping. His Operation Clean Slate had curdled into a slow-motion catastrophe with his fingerprints all over it, and corporate had begun to circle. He came down to the floor at odd hours now, watching Dawson's people scramble. Saying nothing, his jaw working. One night, at the end of his rope, he stood over Dawson and said the thing he'd sworn he'd never say. "Bring the technician back. As a consultant, whatever it takes." Dawson bristled. 12 engineers, humbled by one man they'd never met. "We don't need him. We're this close. You've been this close for 2 weeks, Voss said. "Get me Ellison." The call went out to Malcolm's old number. It went to voicemail, and the next call, and the one after that. Malcolm sat in his garage and watched the little screen light up with the name of the company that had priced him at 1/12 of its future, and he felt something he hadn't expected. Patience, the deep-settled patience of a man who's finally been proven right and is in no hurry at all. He would go back. He'd already decided that not for Voss, but for the floor workers who'd looked away in shame for Danny for the plain truth of the thing. But he'd go back on his terms, in his time, and not 1 minute before the building understood exactly what it had thrown away. The days ground down. Dawson's crew stopped talking at lunch. The floor workers who'd once envied the 12 their polos and their pay now watched them with a strange, quiet pity, the pity of people who know a secret that the experts don't. "You can't run his machine," their silence said. "We could have told you that. You never asked." On the 10th day of the crisis, the aerospace client sent someone new, not a manager, an auditor, a quiet woman with a university lanyard and a reputation that walked into the room a step ahead of her, brought in to sign off or refuse to sign off on whether Halverson Precision was competent to hold the contract at all. She spent an hour on the floor saying almost nothing. She watched a batch fail. She watched Dawson's team scramble around a system that reported itself perfectly healthy while quietly ruining every part that mattered. She asked one floor worker how long the plant had run before all this. 19 years, he told her. And who kept it running? The old man, he said, and then caught himself and looked away. Then she asked politely if she might see the system's core control architecture. Dawson hesitated and handed it over, because you do not say no to the person holding your contract. She read the first screen, then the second. Her expression didn't change, but she stopped moving entirely, the way a person stops when they hear their own name spoken in a language they didn't expect anyone in the room to know. She scrolled past the interface, past the control loops, down to the algorithm's header, to a line of authorship most people would have skipped and read the initials stamped there. Then Dr. Vivian Brooks looked up from the screen very slowly and asked the room a question in a voice gone strangely soft. "Who," she said, "wrote this?" And not one of the 12 engineers hired to run this machine could answer her. The silence stretched long enough to become its own confession. Kyle Dawson cleared his throat. "It's a vendor package, licensed years ago. We inherited it." "You inherited it," Dr. Brooks repeated. She turned back to the screen and rested 2 fingers on the glass, almost tenderly, the way you touch the frame of a painting you've admired your whole career and never once expected to meet. "You don't understand what you inherited." She stood, and when she faced the room, she carried the client's entire contract in the set of her shoulders. 2 years ago, she said, a paper was published in a peer-reviewed journal. A self-calibrating tolerance algorithm, the first design of its kind that could hold aerospace precision on aging hardware. My firm has been trying to license the underlying method for 18 months. We couldn't find the author. He published under initials and never answered our letters. A pause. M. Ellison. Voss, who had just walked in, made a small sound in his throat. Brooks looked at him. "This machine isn't failing," she said. "It's protecting itself. Whoever built it wrote an integrity lock into the core, a safeguard that degrades precision when the calibration keys aren't renewed by their author. Not by a team, by him. One signature, his." She let it settle. "It's the most elegant piece of defensive engineering I've seen in 20 years. Your 12 engineers can't break it because it was never meant to be broken. It was built to make one thing unmistakable, that the man who wrote it was irreplaceable." The room had gone the specific white of people watching a mistake become permanent. "You're telling me," Voss said slowly, "the whole line runs on code written by your maintenance technician." Brooks' voice didn't rise, it didn't have to. "The black man you removed from a photograph. The one you replaced with 12 people who cannot do what he did." She almost smiled, and there was no cruelty in it, only a terrible clarity. "Whoever built this machine was a genius, Mr. Voss. And your genius problem is very simple. You fired him." Dawson sat down heavily in a chair that wasn't his. For a moment, nobody moved. Then one of the 12, the young engineer, who'd found nothing but dead ends for 2 weeks, spoke almost to himself. "That comment in the core," he said quietly, "a machine should only obey the one who understands it." He looked up at Brooks. "That was a signature, wasn't it?" He wasn't hiding. He was waiting. He was waiting, Brooks agreed. for someone to finally read what he wrote. The words landed on Voss like a verdict. Every diagnostic his 12 engineers had run, every green checkmark, every confident report the machine had been telling them the truth the whole time, in a language none of them had bothered to learn. The man who spoke it had been standing in front of them for 19 years, holding a caliper, being called furniture. Voss looked at the gray box on the corkboard photo and felt for the first time afraid. His mind was already sprinting through the arithmetic of the disaster, the contract, the deadline corporate, the story of it, the photograph, and arriving at every turn at the same locked door. Malcolm Ellison, the name he'd spent 2 weeks trying to reach, and before that one meeting, trying to erase. "He's a technician," Voss said, grasping. "The IP belongs to the company." "Does it?" Brooks tilted her head. "The patent I've chased for 18 months is filed to an individual, not to Halverson." She let that detonate quietly. "You may want to check what you actually own before you tell me what he can't do." Every certainty Gerald Voss had carried into that plant 3 weeks earlier lay on the floor in pieces. The tired old man he'd priced at 1/12 of the future was the reason the future existed at all. Malcolm's calm question on his last day, "Who renews the keys?" replayed in Voss's head, and he understood far too late that it hadn't been sour grapes. It had been a man handing him a loaded question and watching him fail to catch it. "Get him back," Voss said hoarsely. "Whatever he wants." "I already tried," Dawson muttered. "He won't answer." Dr. Brooks picked up her bag. At the door she paused, and for the first time all afternoon she looked genuinely angry, not on her own behalf, but on behalf of a man who wasn't even in the room to see himself proven right. "Then I'd stop giving orders," she said quietly, "and start writing an apology. Because right now the only person on earth who can save this contract is a man you threw away for the color of his skin." The door closed behind her. And 3 miles across town, in a garage, nobody had ever been invited into Malcolm Ellison's phone, lit up with a message from Danny, 6 words that changed everything. They know. The PhD knows. "Come." He made them wait a full day. Not out of spite, out of principle. A man erased in an afternoon was owed at least 24 hours of being missed. When Malcolm Ellison finally walked back into Halverson Precision, he walked into the same glass conference room where his face had been deleted and Voss had on purpose assembled everyone. The 12 engineers, the managers, Danny at the back, hands twisted in her sleeves, and Dr. Vivian Brooks seated to one side, watching the door as if it were the most interesting thing in the building. The door opened, and nobody said anything. For a long beat 2 full seconds. 3, there was only the sound of Malcolm's footsteps crossing the room, unhurried the brass caliper, a small weight in his shirt pocket. The 12 engineers who'd been hired to replace him watched a 51-year-old man in a plain jacket cross the floor, and to their credit, not one of them mistook him for furniture anymore. He nodded to Dr. Brooks first. "Peer to peer. Dr. Ellison," she said, "I've read your paper 4 times. "Then you've read it 3 times more than anyone here," he said. It wasn't a boast. It was a diagnosis. He turned to Voss last, and he was unfailingly, almost unsettlingly, polite. "You wanted to see me," Malcolm said. Voss stood too fast, his chair scraping. "Malcolm, let's talk like reasonable men. The line's having issues. We think you can help. Naturally, we'd compensate. The line isn't having issues," Malcolm said gently. "The line is doing exactly what I built it to do." The room held its breath. Malcolm walked to the screen, picked up the controller Dawson had been failing with for 2 weeks, and pulled up the architecture, his architecture. He didn't hide it now. He let them all see the shape of the thing, the elegance Dawson had marveled at in secret, and couldn't open. 19 years. Malcolm said, almost conversationally. You had me changing filters and reading flags, and every night I was building the thing that would run this whole floor. I wrote the tolerance algorithm. I filed the patent, under my own name. He glanced at Voss. The name you deleted from a photograph. Dawson spoke up, a last small reflex of pride. The system's still company property. The code runs on company hardware. Malcolm looked at him with something close to kindness. You own the hardware, he said. You don't own the key. A machine without its key is just an expensive paperweight. He turned a single dial on the controller, a tiny motion, and on the floor beyond the glass, a test bracket came off the line flawless, perfect, gleaming. The first good part in 15 days. 12 engineers stared at it like men watching water turn to wine. Then Malcolm turned the dial back. The next bracket failed. That's the difference, he said quietly, between 12 engineers and one signature. Dawson stood, then not to argue, but because a man has to stand for the thing he's about to say. That line in your core, he said. A machine should only obey the one who understands it. His voice was steadier than he felt. I read it at 2 a.m. I've been an engineer for 15 years. That's the truest thing I've ever found in a piece of code. He paused. I was hired to replace you. I couldn't replace one sentence you wrote. The room was very quiet. Malcolm looked at him for a long moment. The lead of the 12. The sharp suit. The smile that had walked in 3 weeks ago, certain of everything. There was no triumph in Malcolm's face, only something that looked almost like respect for a man honest enough to say it out loud. That sentence, Malcolm said, took me 19 years to earn the right to write. You read it in one night. That's not nothing. Dawson swallowed and nodded and sat back down a different man than the one who'd stood up. Voss went the color of ash. You can't hold the contract hostage. I'm not holding anything hostage. Malcolm set the controller down. You hired 12 people to replace one man. I'm just letting the machine show you how that math worked out. It was Dr. Brooks who broke the silence, and she was almost smiling. Legally, she said to the room, the patent is his. The integrity lock is his. Without his authorization, this plant cannot fulfill our contract. I've confirmed it with counsel. She looked at Voss. You don't have a negotiation. You have a request to make. Politely. Then the young engineer, who'd found the buried sentence, stood too, crossed the room to Malcolm, and put out his hand. Best code I've ever read, he said. I'm sorry we didn't know. Malcolm shook his hand. The hierarchy of the entire room inverted in that single gesture, and everyone felt the floor tilt under it. But he didn't gloat. That was the thing Voss would never understand about the man he'd thrown away. Malcolm had no appetite for humiliation, not even earned humiliation. He turned to face the whole room, and his voice changed, dropped its edge, went level and serious. Here's what happens, he said. I'll stabilize the line. I'll save your contract. I can do it in a day. He let them exhale, then stopped the exhale mid-breath, but not for nothing, and not quietly. Anything, Voss said. Name it. The record gets corrected, every part of it. Malcolm's eyes moved to the corkboard photo, to the gray box where his face had been. The people on this floor you called redundant. They get protected, trained, promoted, and the truth about who built this system gets told out loud to the same people who watched you erase me. Voss nodded frantically, a drowning man agreeing to anything within reach. Yes, of course. I'll handle the announcement personally. Malcolm studied him a moment, and something in his face suggested he already knew exactly what a man like Gerald Voss did with the word personally. He was right to be suspicious, because that night, alone in his office with the door locked, Voss opened a blank document and began to draft a press release. And in it, the line was saved by the exceptional work of Halverson's 12-engineer automation team. And the name Malcolm Ellison did not appear anywhere at all. The contract signing was a spectacle, and Voss had planned it that way. Press along one wall, corporate leadership in the front row, a live stream running to investors and to the aerospace client's headquarters, a banner reading, Halverson Precision, Engineering the Future, and 12 engineers arranged behind the podium like a trophy shelf with Gerald Voss front and center, ready to step into a moment he intended to own. He'd fixed nothing himself. Malcolm had stabilized the line the day before, quietly, in under 3 hours, one authorization, one renewed key, and the machines that had failed for 2 weeks ran clean as a held note. But Voss had the microphone now, and possession, he believed, was the whole game. Today marks a new era, Voss began, smiling into the stream. Through the vision and hard work of our automation team, before you continue, Mr. Voss. Dr. Vivian Brooks rose from the front row. She held the client's leverage in one hand, and it turned out a printout in the other. The stream was live. Voss could not object without objecting on camera in front of every investor in the company. On behalf of our client, Brooks said pleasantly, I'd like to introduce the engineer whose work actually made this contract possible. The investors watching deserve his name. She didn't wait for permission. 2 weeks ago, she told the room and the cameras and the world, this company terminated a man. Then it spent a fortune hiring 12 engineers to replace him and discovered they couldn't run a single machine he'd designed. She let it breathe. I stood in that plant and told them a genius built their system. I was right. Here he is, the man they erased from a photograph and replaced with 12 of us for the color of his skin. She turned. Malcolm Ellison. The room turned with her. And Danny Carter, small, terrified 23, stepped out of the crowd and set one object on the podium in front of the cameras. A sealed white envelope, red stamp, slightly crooked. Transition. This is what they gave him, she said, her voice shaking and holding at once. 2 weeks before he saved all of you. The stream detonated. You could watch it happen in real time, phones, lifting reporters leaning in, comments scrolling faster than anyone could read. The story left the building and kept going out past the parking lot, out past the city, out to every person who'd ever been measured by their face before their work. Voss stood frozen at the podium, the ash-colored center of a moment he'd built to crown himself and had instead built to bury himself. Malcolm walked to the microphone. He was offered the floor, the vindication, the speech of a lifetime lived to the world. He declined all of it. Instead, he leaned toward the mic and did something no one expected. He thanked the floor workers, one by one, by name the men who'd looked away in shame, called back now into the light. And then he turned unhurried and thanked the 12 engineers. You proved something, he told them, and he meant it. It took 12 of the best to fail at my work. Highest review I've ever gotten. A few of the 12 laughed, the stunned, grateful laugh of people handed their dignity by the man they'd tried to replace. Only Voss wasn't laughing. The cameras swung to him for a reaction. He opened his mouth, and nothing came out. And then from the front row, a woman stood, Catherine Wells Corporate's regional vice president, who had flown in that morning and watched the whole thing. She walked to the microphone, looked at Gerald Voss, and said 6 words, live to every investor in the company. Gerald, my office, now. There is a particular quiet that follows a public reckoning, the sound of a building rearranging itself around a truth it can no longer deny. Halverson Precision spent the next month in that quiet. Gerald Voss did not get a dramatic downfall. He got something worse for a man like him, an ordinary one. Catherine Wells didn't fire him at the podium. Corporate had lawyers, and lawyers hate theater. Instead, over the following weeks, Voss was quietly relieved of the plant reassigned to a regional role, with a longer title and no authority, and moved to an office where the Operation Clean Slate deck that had once been his masterpiece now sat in a legal file marked evidence. The promotion he'd been one step from evaporated. He'd tried to erase one man to look modern and instead made himself the cautionary tale every manager in the company would whisper about for a decade. Nobody had to punish him harder than that. The story did it for them. There was a small moment weeks later that no camera caught. Voss cleaning out his old office, past the lobby on his way to the parking lot for the last time as plant manager. Malcolm was there adjusting the new photograph on the wall. The two men looked at each other across the empty room. Voss opened his mouth, perhaps to apologize, perhaps to explain. In the end, he managed only 4 words. "I didn't know you." "You didn't ask," Malcolm said. Not cruel, just true. Voss nodded slowly, the way a man nods when the floor of his certainty has finally given out. Then he left, and the door swung shut behind him, and Malcolm turned back to the photograph and straightened it another 1/4 inch until the whole crew sat perfectly level in the frame. He didn't watch Voss go. A man who has spent 19 years being unseen learns eventually that the sweetest thing in the world is not revenge. It's no longer needing it. The aerospace client, for its part, did not walk. Dr. Brooks made sure of it. With the integrity lock renewed and the line running flawless, the zero defect clause was met with room to spare, and the contract Voss had nearly killed became the most profitable in Halvorson's history. The irony escaped no one. The deal that was supposed to require a modern face had been saved by the very man that face was meant to replace. Catherine Wells offered Malcolm Ellison anything. She meant it literally. A vice presidency, a corner office, a salary with a comma in a new place. She sat across from him in the same glass conference room where he'd been deleted and slid an offer across the table that would have made most men's hands shake. Malcolm didn't reach for it. "I don't want the office," he said. Wells blinked. "Then tell me what you want, whatever it is." He'd thought about this for a long time 3 miles away in a locked garage across 19 years of being underestimated. "I want a lab," Malcolm said. "Here, on this floor. Funded. An applied systems division that trains the technicians this company was about to throw away. The ones who read flags and change filters and know more than anyone gives them credit for." He paused. "I spent my whole life building things in secret. I don't want it to be a secret anymore, and I don't want to be the only one." Wells was quiet a moment. Then she uncapped her pen. "Yun, what's the first hire?" "Danny Harder," Malcolm said, without hesitation. "Apprentice engineer. She's been writing down everything I say for 2 years. Time somebody paid her for it." Across the floor, when Danny heard, she cried in the maintenance cage, where no one could see, and then laughed because Malcolm found her there anyway, and pretended kindly not to notice. The 12 engineers were handled with a grace that surprised everyone. This perhaps told you the most about Malcolm Ellison. He could have had them dismissed with a word the men hired to erase him. He didn't. Several of them, it turned out, wanted to stay. The young one who'd shaken his hand asked almost shyly if he could work under Ellison, and Malcolm said yes. Within a month, 4 of the original 12 had joined the new Applied Systems Lab, learning from the man they'd been brought in to replace, sitting shoulder to shoulder with the floor workers they'd been meant to make obsolete. It was the theme of the whole thing made physical. 12 degrees had never been the problem. erasing the one mind that could have led them that had been the problem. Put the mind back at the center, and the 12 became exactly what they should have been all along: good engineers doing good work, no longer pretending to own something they'd only borrowed. Malcolm's other life stopped being secret too. The university confirmed the fellowship. Dr. Ellison would present the tolerance algorithm at the spring symposium, after all, and this time, when they called, he answered on the first ring. The daughter he'd quietly funded through her own engineering program flew home for a weekend and stood in the lobby of Halvorsen Precision, looking at her father the way Danny did, the way Dr. Brooks did, the way people look at someone whose quiet turned out to be the loudest thing in the room. And the locked garage, the workbench, the 3 monitors, the years of degrees earned in the dark was finally opened, not to the public, to Danny and to the 4 engineers whom Malcolm invited over one Saturday and walked through the birthplace of the entire system Halvorsen ran on. They stood among the evidence of a life spent building, in secret schematics, pinned 3 deep notebooks, in a careful hand, a first prototype of the tolerance rig held together with patience and spare parts, and understood at last exactly what the company had almost thrown in the trash. There was one more thing, and it happened without ceremony. On his last afternoon clearing out the old maintenance cage, the cramped space he was leaving for the new lab, Malcolm found something taped to his locker. Dead center. A sealed white envelope. For one cold second, 19 years of muscle memory braced for the red stamp. But this envelope was different. The stamp was new, pressed careful and straight this time, and it read a different word: welcome. Inside, in Danny's handwriting, was a single line: for the man who was never actually leaving. Malcolm stood in the empty cage, a long moment holding it. Then he took the old printout from his shirt pocket, the one he'd folded and kept on the worst afternoon of his career, the cheerful blue line that read, "Replace 1 with 12, and he laid the 2 pieces of paper side by side on the bench. The company's verdict and the floor's answer. He kept both. A man should remember the exact moment the world told him what it thought he was worth, and he should remember just as clearly the moment it was proven wrong. Then Malcolm Ellison picked up his father's brass caliper, walked out of the cage for the last time, and crossed the floor to a door with a fresh nameplate, Applied Systems Lab, where 4 former rivals and 1 brilliant apprentice were waiting for him to begin. He didn't make a speech. He set the caliper on the new bench the way his father had once set it on an old one and rolled up his sleeves. "All right," he said. "Let's build something nobody can erase." 1 year later, the floor Gerald Voss had wanted to modernize was the most watched training facility in the region. They came from 3 states over now, technicians and apprentices, and a few humbled engineers with fancy degrees and quiet questions to learn at the Applied Systems Lab at Halvorsen Precision, where the man who ran it had a rule he never wrote down, but everyone absorbed anyway. The machine doesn't care where you went to school. It only cares if you're right. Danny Carter wasn't an apprentice anymore. She'd filed her first patent that spring, a refinement to Malcolm's tolerance method that he'd insisted go under her name over her protests because he knew better than anyone what it cost to build brilliant things under initials nobody bothered to read. It hung, framed on the lab wall beside his published paper, the student next to the teacher, and Malcolm looked at the pair of them every morning the way some men look at a sunrise. He still arrived before dawn. Some habits are older than any wound. He still unlocked the lab, set down his thermos, and laid out his father's brass caliper on the bench, the jaws polished silver thin from 50 years now of use. But the space around it had changed. Where there had once been one man working in silence, there were now a dozen learning out loud. In the lobby, the photograph had changed too. Voss's staged rebrand image was gone. In its place hung a real photograph taken the day the lab opened. The whole floor crew, the 4 engineers who'd stayed Danny, grinning at the edge, Dr. Brooks visiting for the occasion, and Malcolm Ellison, dead center. No blank gray box, no deleted face, just a room full of people. The company had once nearly thrown away standing together in the light. Sometimes a new technician would ask about the story everyone had heard, some version by now, the viral one, the one where the black man they replaced with 12 engineers turned out to be the genius who built the machine. And Malcolm would tell it, but never the way they expected. He never made himself the hero of it. He'd point at the photograph and name the floor workers first, the way he had at the podium, because the thing he wanted people to understand wasn't that a proud man got vindicated. It was quieter than that, and harder. They had looked at him, a 51-year-old black man in a maintenance uniform, and decided they knew exactly what he was worth. 1/12 of the future, a face to delete, a fit issue, and the whole time the mind that ran their entire world had been sitting right in front of them, patient, unbothered, waiting to be asked the right question by anyone willing to look past the uniform and the age and the color of his skin. They never learned his handwriting when they saw it. That had been their loss, not his. The last lesson of any given day was always the same, and it was the one his father had taught him first. Malcolm would call over the newest technician, usually the youngest, usually the one everyone else had already underestimated, and place the worn brass caliper into their hands and close their fingers around it. "It's not about the reading on the dial," he'd say. "It's about being right when nobody's watching. Do that long enough, and one day the whole room has to admit it." Then he'd let go and watch the caliper pass into a new pair of hands, the way it had passed into his, and would he suspected keep passing long after anyone remembered the name of the man who'd tried to erase him. They'd thought it would take 12 to replace one. They never understood that some people aren't a head count. They're the reason the count works at all. If you've ever been counted out, erased, replaced, priced at a fraction of what you knew you were worth, then you already know how this story feels. So tell me down in the comments who taught you your worth, and when did the room finally have to admit it? Because somebody's brass caliper is waiting for your hands too.